So just to let you know, the Democracy for All event is taking place in Barcelona and at the university in Barcelona. So what you see here is the Auditorium Maximo in Spain, and they are live broadcasting directly from this event. So Kirsten, feel free to speak up whenever you're ready.
Okay, yeah, I think we can start now. Thank you. Well, thank you for coming. I think I'm going to introduce the topic and then we'll continue with the panel. I'm going to talk about voting systems for secure elections in the context of, yes, decentralized identities, blockchains, and other enabling technologies. Okay. So I'd like to start saying that, or make a distinction between voting and democracy, right? Voting doesn't guarantee democracy. There is a number of pillars for a true, fair democracy, as we can see here. And usually when we talk about e-democracy, the focus is on the act of voting, although the act of voting itself will not grant a full functioning democracy. And usually the democracy is considered, e-democracy, sorry, is considered desirable because improves the transparency, reduces the fraud, reduces the cost, and increases the efficiency of voting, right? And it's supposed to make to increase the democracy in our societies. Although that's something I like to challenge a bit. So then, what is the status in technology, right? This still holds true, right? This is a very old comic, but I think it really reflects the feeling from many people that have worked in the field of remote voting, digital votes, e-democracy, etc., right? Which basically is not only the technology that you need to trust for this to work, and that is what makes people a bit nervous around this topic. The common challenges, or when people approach the digital voting idea, the focus is always on three things, or most of the technical solutions and the technical approaches to voting or electronic voting move around security, privacy, and auditability, right? Making it more transparent, more auditable, reducing the fraud, making it secure and private, right? For obvious reasons. But these are, in my opinion, all known challenges for which we have plenty of solutions right now, right? So just to give you some summary, when it comes to security, right, there is a basic assumption that is that you need to have an identity, right? That is the basic assumption of all electronic voting systems. And you can make that identity self-sovereign. You can make it centralized. There are many models, right, to implement that in a country. But there is an underlying assumption that there is a government that is issuing these identities in a fair manner, right, to its citizens, right, that is granting the right to identity. Technology is not gonna grant that right. It could make that right more self-sovereign, right, with a decentralized model. But still, there are some trust assumptions on the government. Then security wallets, like we have in. Yes, Lord. Okay, like we can see in that is, I think we have some interference. So we have the EUDI wallet, the European wallet, that's coming into effect in 2026 as an example of an enabler for every citizen to have a digital version of their identity. There are some electronic vote revocation mechanisms that have been developed over the years to reduce the chances of coercion in remote voting. And then there is things like trustless on-chain voting that we can see in DAOs, right? In the blockchain world, there is something called DAOs, autonomous organizations that organize themselves around a topic, and they can vote by basically publish a transaction on-chain, which means there are no men in the middle. There is no software enclosed box or machine or voting machines or anything. You are directly talking to an immutable piece of code that nobody can change, that is fully auditable, right? So I would say that is the maximum level of decentralization, auditability, and transparency. On the privacy side, we have developed over the last years a number of solutions to hide the identifiers of the voting people, like pairwise ID. The idea of pairwise ID is that every time you vote, you are offering a different version of your identifier. We can also prove your uniqueness in a privacy way. Like we can make sure that you can only vote once without exposing any identifier or anything that is linked to you. And then we also have all the zero knowledge magic, right? That we can prove that you are eligible to vote, you're the citizen of the country, that you have voted already. We can prove all these things without disclosing any data. So the combination of different cryptographic primitives really creates a privacy chain of trust, right? And finally, for auditability, I think this is the weakest part because although we have blockchains and we have on-chain verifications, there is a lot of electronic voting systems that are still relying on trusted execution environments, right? And trusted execution environments, in the end, is trust, right? You need to put on some organization, company, or closed box. Doesn't comply with security, privacy, and auditability, we need to assume that it was a political decision, right? So I think we are at the point, and at least in these 3 chapters, where technology has proven that is feasible and possible, right? And if we find any elections designed in a way that don't comply with any of these topics, it was a political decision. It was not a technical limitation. Now, new challenges for digital democracy, I would say, are disinformation, the existence of still trusted systems, and the remote or full remote voting, right? Disinformation, I think, is the biggest one, and it affects democracy. It doesn't affect the act of voting. So if we think that the scope of the technical solution is just on the voting, right, we shouldn't be concerned about disinformation, right? But I think we need to wonder what happens when we make voting so easy, so fast, and so cheap, right, in a world where disinformation has the ability to impact democracy so heavily. Then we also see a lot of trusted systems in a lot of elections and digital democracies, right, that they rely on voting machines, on closed box, on closed organizations or companies. And then the last one is going full remote, right? The idea that an election can be held fully digitally, fully remote with any physical infrastructure, right? It's quite challenging, right? It's quite challenging because paper turned to be an amazing technology, and that is not that easy to replace. So I will explore some of the solutions for these new challenges. Just to give you an idea, what are the areas of research or development that we can resort to for answers. About this information, I think it has been said many times during this conference that I think we're going to move from a paradigm where we are going to be trusting the content to a new paradigm where we will trust only the source.
Sorry.
Right? So there's going to be a need for source verification, for source verifiability, traceability, right? And I would say that goes in both ways. We will need verifiable identities that will live in public registries and ecosystems of trust, but we will also need content to have its own credentials, right? And its own supply chain verifiability, right? There are some initiatives like content credentials, right? Led by the giants like Apple, Microsoft, Adobe, and all the press, right? They're working to provide verifiable credentials for content, but then that needs to go hand in hand with digital identity. So in the end, I should be able to look at a piece of content in the same way I look at a container coming from a ship, right? If a container comes in a ship, there's a full supply chain traceability, right, to an origin, right? And this is where we should be going, right? So if you're interested in the topic, I think these are some this is an interesting project to look for. For the next challenge for the trusted systems, right? The solutions are the old traditional solutions. I think this is more a willingness or a political willingness to move in this direction and stop trusting in closed systems. Open source, open standards, of course, tons of them. Interoperability is always a challenge when you standardize, right? And I think in the identity, we have very strong problems with the interoperability, but I think also the European identity, the ADAS and EUDI is going to be a big player in the same way GDPR was standardizing data protection across the world. I think this new framework is going to standardize the technology, the identity stack across the world. Then there are some concepts that we can import from blockchain, like trustless by design, right? And trustless by design means that I don't need to trust anything. I can verify everything. We have verifiable data with signatures, CK. We have verifiable computation, like Jordi was presenting before, right? We have immutable contracts. We have all the elements to make the system trustless. And then I would advocate for progressive decentralization, right? Decentralization is a goal, right? But in big scenarios like national elections, achieving full decentralization is quite ambitious, right? But I think many projects have proven how this progressive decentralization is feasible. And the last one, I thought just an interesting project if you want to check it, it's called Macy. It was a research done by the Ethereum Foundation. Everything was presented last year in Belgrade. It's a framework to prevent coercion, right? An anti-collusion in fully remote elections, right? The challenge is if you're voting from home or you can vote from your phone, right? You can be coerced. You can be forced to vote for someone. Right? Or you can be monitored, you can be chased. I mean, your physical security or integrity is not secure when you're not in a physical booth with a piece of paper, right? So there is a number of strategies to solve for that, right? I think this is an interesting project to see how cryptography and some smart construction with the existing blocks can solve for this. I will close it with this, right? And I think we have time for the panel. I think we have very interesting panelists. After doing a review of these new challenges and old challenges, I think we cannot ignore the new reality, right? And how democracies have been eroding over the last years because manipulation of the civic education and awareness have become in an industry, right? And so I like this quote that says, okay, when you are you're already going in the wrong direction. Speeding up is gonna only make mistakes faster, right? So I think worrying or putting a lot of effort in making the vote electronic because it's cheaper, it's faster, it's more efficient, or it's supposedly to be more transparent without taking into account that creating a scenario where we can call flash referendums on very hot topics, right? That sounds great, right? But I would think we need to examine the new powers that electronic voting will give us in the current circumstance. And with that, and I know that that's quite a controversial thinking. If you want to know more about our project, in case you didn't know why I was talking about all these things, I'm representing a project called Privado ID that works on decentralized digital identities with a strong focus on zero knowledge and privacy. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sebastiano. I saw that.
Thank you. So welcome to the panel, Digital Identity and Privacy in a Hyper-Connected World, Blockchain in Voting Systems. So we're going to look at voting systems today. I'm Natalie. I'm with the Web3 Foundation Polkadot. I'm doing public policy and government affairs. So I'm mainly watching out for regulations that impact the Web3 space. And if they do, I go and educate lawmakers on that. And in that context, I'm realizing code is political in many instances and has impact on society, and therefore actually evokes a lot of societal debates on values that we all care about. And in that context, I think it's interesting to discuss today also voting systems and how they could be maybe improved by these emerging technologies. So with me on the panel, I have digitally on the screen, Sebastian next to me. CPO of Privado ID. We just heard from him, leads the development of decentralized identity protocols for next generation internet, and his experiences growing up in Argentina under dictatorship fuel his advocacy for crypto and decentralization. Is that correct? Good.
Yes.
Good. We'll get to that, and also get into maybe examples of other systems, like maybe Argentina. Maybe you have something to share, use cases that would benefit. Then on the screen, Dieter Brockmeyer, a senior media and innovation expert, author, chief project officer of Diplomatic World in Brussels. It's a magazine focused on political stakeholders and the co-founder of and director of innovation and time at the Diplomatic World Institute. He curates global industry events and co-hosts a video podcast, and he created the DWY Holistic World Innovation Trophy. This trophy gives awards innovative tech projects that have a positive impact on society. And then
it was always giving out in Barcelona for the last 4 times.
Sorry?
And it was given out in Barcelona for since it's existing.
Okay. The connection, I mean, I don't know. I hear you a bit bad, but is it okay for you guys? Where is our tech support? Dieter, do you have an opportunity to maybe enhance your mic?
Well, my mic is directly in front of me.
Much better now. Keep it like this.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Okay, then next to me I have Alexeis. He's a founder of Apadride Network, a coalition of stateless individuals, communities, and stateless-led organizations. And he is a human rights activist, so he cares about identity for smaller stateless groups. Is that correct? Do you want to add?
Oh, I mean, I wouldn't call them smaller. I also
Okay, minorities. That was
yes, minorities. But yes, I work in human rights and not so much as an activist, but an advocate for vulnerable populations, people who don't have human rights, and of course, stateless people are quite numerous throughout the world, including here in Europe. And so I'm here to talk about the excluded, and of course, the excluded also don't enjoy political rights. So I'll get into that when it's my turn.
Great. And then last but not least, Matthias, 15 years of experience in capital markets and alternative investments with a focus on hedge funds, has been working in various roles for large investment banks and became the COO of a Web3 gaming platform before joining SkyTel Digital. Also an asset manager focused on early stage Web3 companies. He will maybe give us the view on how to finance all these great ideas that we have today. Okay, maybe let's start off. So we had a great intro in terms of technical solutions, in terms of voting systems. And you identified already a lot of problems of democracies, right? So what we're facing is, and I trust in governments. This is something I think we can't really solve, but I'd love to discuss it. So then we have disinformation and we have the ability to vote remotely. Do you guys see any chances in these technologies? What would blockchain and e-identity resolve in terms of problems we see with democracy? Anybody who wants to add into that? Otherwise, I'll name someone.
I think I can start. So as was mentioned, I'm with stateless-led organization, and not many people know about statelessness. So I'll start out by describing the problem. It's going to be a bit depressing, but then I'll conclude hopefully on a happy note, or at least a hopeful note, and tie the whole type into blockchain and possible solutions that are out there that are all being implemented. So statelessness is when somebody doesn't have a legal connection to any country. It's when they don't belong to any country. Now that means that they don't have any human rights, because all the human rights that you enjoy, that you can think of, employment, freedom of movement, the right to vote, a right to education, you only have it because you belong to a country. If you have no country, you don't have access to these rights. Now, it actually impacts quite a few people in the world. There's 1 billion people in the world who don't have any legal identification. That's according to the World Bank. And we don't know how many more have legal identification like I have, which is a degraded form of legal identification, but you're not allowed, access to many of the basic rights, like voting. So when we talk about democracy, it's important to highlight that democracy is very much about drawing out the in-group and the out-group. And what happens when within any democracy or any country whatsoever, the minorities or the political opposition or any other unwanted people all of a sudden get labeled as traitors or not belonging or never been from there, even if they are factually from there. So this unfortunately happens from time to time. And of course, we have different cases. Belarus right now is making 500,000 people stateless, and their children are almost instantly stateless because it refuses to renew documents of its political exiles that try to support democracy and defend democracy when there were, very questionable fraudulent elections in 2020. Then we have, Bahrain that just flat out found an easy way to get rid of political opposition by just denationalizing, just getting rid of their citizenship. And of course, classical examples of American Samoa. There are Americans who are American nationals, but they're not citizens of US, so they don't have the right to vote. And that ties into the, American colonial past of taking over Pacific Islands and didn't want to give voting rights to these people. So, and I mean, these are just some examples. I mean, in Europe, we have quite a few as well, including, in the Baltics, Balkans, and a few other countries. But, I don't know how much time I have. I should probably
back and forth. But
Yeah.
you said 1 billion people. How do you see the technology solving that issue?
Right. So that's where I was going to go into the sort of happy note that stateless people, we already see solutions and we're already using these solutions. For instance, when you go to a bank, what does the bank ask you as the first thing? Your legal identity. They want to see proof of that. When you're a stateless person, you either don't have any legal identity or you have legal ID like I have that the banks are not going to understand, even though they're actually required to take this ID on. But if I'm not in that country that issued that ID, it's not going to be well known in some other country. So we have a lot of issues of refugees and stateless people all over the world being arbitrarily denied services like banking or education, et cetera, because the authorities just don't understand why would a country where this person is from give them a degraded form of legal ID. And so now we see solutions in blockchain because you can have a crypto wallet. You can be your own bank, and there's obviously problems with the exchanges. And I personally also face this. I tried to, initially go to Binance and they didn't understand my ID. So they refused to open an account for me, Kraken as well. And that actually lost a lot of money basically, in the potential, because I was back in the day when these exchanges first popped up. And I couldn't buy the cryptocurrency, so my legal form of ID really was a barrier. So there's others but there's other solutions we see that we're most interested in, the potential of decentralization of identification, because to this day, governments, countries have absolute monopolies on certain aspects of our lives. Monopoly of violence is always going to be there. For governments, we're never going to get rid of that. And it's probably for the better. But there's other monopolies that they've had, they began to lose. The media. Now everybody can be their own journalist, anybody with a smartphone. The governments, even authoritarian countries, are struggling to control this. They're trying to claw back that control, but they're failing. Currency. Governments had monopoly on that. No longer the case. But the monopolies they still have in legal identifications and belonging is still firmly in their grasp. And it's actually bad for everybody, not just vulnerable populations. It's actually bad for all of you here as well, potentially, because no government can guarantee to you what future government will hold power or who will be elected and who they will go after. So ideally, we would like to have a plan B if some abusive government comes to power and decides to cancel your legal identification because you decide to defend democracy, or just because of who you are as a minority, religious group, or belonging to a minority or religious group, or just because you're a woman, because 24 countries don't allow women to pass on nationality. Many European countries didn't start allowing women to be fully citizens and pass on nationality until the 70s and 80s. So Europeans don't know about that. We should. So I'll stop right there. There's a lot of potential, and decentralized identification is creating a safety net for all of us, even people who do enjoy citizenship and nationality.
I already have a lot to say, but I saw Dieter also raising his hand, so I don't want to step forward.
Yeah, because you made a very complex problem sound very easy, and I fear it's not as easy going, since If we want to use um, blockchain in democratic voting, we do need a recognized digital identity, and we are very far away from that. We have many digital identities. We have our digital identities on social media platforms with banks, as you mentioned, but no, most of them are controlled by the stakeholders and not by ourselves. And we really do need to get a more common sense into it, so that everybody is recognizing and accepting this identity, because otherwise we will run into uh, lots of debates, and we can question results over and over again by just saying, hey, we're not wrong identities, the wrong people were voting, and so on. So we have to be really cautious about that. And there's a lot of, well, questions asked first and solutions provided. And this will not be easy, especially when we're looking on the global scale. Every country, because we were talking about the monopoly of governments, they will not give up their monopolies, at least not easily. And so there will be lots of struggles and a lot of different systems competing with each other. And this will make, at least for a significant period, everything quite, well, how should I say it, debatable.
I want to add now. So we've heard, I mean, democracy is eroding. We've heard all the issues you mentioned in terms of the monopoly of governments. I think there's two aspects we have to separate. There's one part, the access to financial means and being unbanked because of the lack of an ID, for example. But also, I mean, this basically goes, this aspect goes a little bit into different problems. This is a different regulation. This is anti-money laundering regulations and terrorist financing, which are affecting human rights organizations, for example, or minority groups, like you mentioned, that are a bit suppressed, because these laws are not only targeting terrorists, depending on, you know, who's looking. Just by definition, if you meet these criteria, you have a harder access to banking. So the technology facilitates that, but the other issue is, and that you mentioned, is being able to vote and be like a citizen that has rights. And that's a problem where we still have a monopoly. And even with the best technology, as you mentioned before, the trust in the government is the liability that is still open, right? And the trust that there would be. You mentioned a plan B. How would that technology provide in solving that issue?
Oh, yeah, then just quickly to respond about the comment. Yeah, and absolutely. I mean, I didn't mean to make it sound like it's easy. You know, I would have loved to keep talking about the topic and how hard it is actually, and all the barriers that we face. But we don't have to, you know, heighten our expectations to the point where we make it difficult for ourselves. We can start simply. You know, many people who are stateless, they're actually children. There's 40 to 45% of all stateless people are actually children. So we can have simple steps like childhood statelessness prevention, and that ties into birth certificates. Many governments still play a hand in determining whether children will get their birth certificates or not. It doesn't have to be this way, you know. So, and
How would you change that?
well, we have partners who are already working on this. They're trying to make sure that, you know, there's ways that children can get their birth certificates without political interference. You know, and by using new technology, by encouraging new technology like blockchain solutions to have hospitals issue certificates without with basic data that's going to be secured, as opposed to being on paper and dependent on offices of different bureaucracy.
So what you're saying is, okay, you would make sure people exist, or there is some sort
Exactly.
of proof digitally this person exists, or this home ownership with this person exists. So if these people get displaced, there is proof that they existed, or,
Exactly.
you know.
Yeah, so secure storage,
But
and
it doesn't give
issuance.
you like civil rights, because there's no
No.
government involved. It would just be a proof, hey, we existed, we had this property, we you know, we're part of this country. Okay.
Yeah, and it's crucial. I think people don't think about it much how that's actually a key first step we haven't achieved yet. Many stateless people don't even feel like they exist. They report themselves feeling like ghosts just because they don't have some most elementary proof of their identity. Never mind legal identity. I think we have to distinguish between legal identity and identity. But even proof that they exist as human beings, many people in the world don't have that. Like I mentioned, 1 billion, this is the 1 billion who have no legal ID, no proof whatsoever, zero.
Has this been a problem? Is there an example in a country where that has been a problem, that there was no proof of existence of people?
Yes, I mean, many countries, that's the stateless people. Yeah, so I mean, in Europe, I'll bring up some examples like Slovenia, when, you know, more than 60,000 people were just deleted from registry secretly by the government. You know, so in other countries, I mean, the classical example, of course, is in the 1930s and 40s with what Germany did in denationalizing its population. But it was not actually to get completely erase their legal identification. It's to change it to their Star of David, brown triangle, so on and so forth, which is also a form of identification, right? So we as Europeans should really remember such historical lessons and try not to repeat them. And so that's why it's important to have secure legal identification in a decentralized form that's not going to be at the mercy of some authority. Because if we give absolute power to any human institution, we're just asking for trouble. So that's it. And we're not looking to override government monopolies. We're just looking to create a healthy competition so that people have a plan B. So they can prove that I am who I am, irrespective of maybe whether you give me voting rights or not. But at least I can prove I am who I am, that maybe I can go to other countries and they know who I am, and they know how to process me now.
Okay, Sebastian, you mentioned trust in government as a problem, but also in systems and disinformation, right? For disinformation, you said, okay, that could be easily solved if there were credentials for social media, like content, for example, or news content, or easily, I don't know, but.
Yeah, I removed the easily
Yeah.
part. So, but I think both things are related. In the end, identity, I think identity is what you and others, the stories that you and others have built around yourself, right? So it's a collection of stories, nothing more. If we agree that something is true, it's going to become true, right? If we certify collectively a piece of content, that is what matters in the end, right? And the same goes with identities, right? I think, yeah, there are some technologies around there, but I think we often fail, especially engineers. We often fail in the fallacy that everything can be solved by technology, everything is a technology problem, right? In this case, it's not. So the technology is there. If we want to use it, if we are not using it, it's because probably the problem is not big enough, right? I think before in a previous talk, they say nobody cares about privacy. Well, because it hasn't become a true problem yet, right? But it will, right? Eventually, like in many countries, at some point, they discover how important it was. And that's why we have laws about it. It's not because we care, because we saw what happens when you don't, right? For the stateless people, right, is the same. So the first step is always any identity system. It's about an identifier and a set of claims, right? These are the stories that we tell, right? The first step, yes, is to say, yes, I can be identified uniquely with this number or this blockchain hash or whatever. The second one is to build a reputation on top of that by allowing others to claim things about you, right? So the first step is, yes, this is my hash in the blockchain, but I can prove that these guys have vouched for me. The other guy said I am his son, and the other guy say, yes, my DNA matches to that other lady, right? And these cumulative claims are the things that are going to build our reputation. And the same goes with content, right? The thing is, we are not seeing content yet as an actor. We are seeing as a passive object, right? That we create as humans, right? So it's a proxy of a real author. Now that content becomes a different thing because objects are creating objects, right? Then we will have to include them also in this reputation system where they will have to be identified and they will have to have a reputation built on top of them.
said before, voting doesn't guarantee democracy. What did you mean?
Well, the democracy in the most philosophical definition, right? It's democracy is supposed to express the willingness and interest of the population, but protecting minorities and inside of a fair system that takes some checks and balances, right? If we just do raising hands, right, without no rules, without protection of minorities, without a legal framework, without warranties, right, that prevent coercion, that prevent the dictatorship of the masses and things like that, that is not democracy. That is something else. That is an assembly, maybe, right? But democracy is more.
Countries like Guatemala, for example, they have tried, they have held elections on actually on Bitcoin with hashes, and they tried to basically show how modern and transparent they are, and they were very sure that they will win the ruling party, which then they didn't. And once the election outcome was there and it was not in their favor, they realized they can't change it anymore because it was on the blockchain. And then they got a little bit upset and they went after the developers, like with criminal charges. And goes back to say, being a developer nowadays, or code is political and you can get yourself in trouble. But the problem is, can digital voting systems actually prevent election fraud? I mean, because at some point in time, when it comes, you need let's say you have a digital identity, and we already established if it's like connected to a voting right, you would have to be kind of signed off by a government at some point in time, right? Couldn't that government also kind of influence how many IDs exist and approve of IDs that are maybe from that people that can vote on the blockchain? Is that like a scenario that could exist? Is that still prone to fraud, election fraud?
Is that a question for me?
Yeah, you're the most tech guy here. So.
Okay. So how to put that? There are tools and there are technologies that allow us to remove the trust in the systems, which means if we decide that for something to work, we need to trust somebody else, that's a decision that we made. It's not necessary. So yes, technology nowadays could create an environment where it would be almost impossible to cheat or to change the results. I think the case of Guatemala is a case where they did it without realizing how far they were going. But there's a good example, because even in the worst environment, when you remove the trust from the equation, right, and you do everything in a verifiable way, even if you don't like the results, that's it, right? So it is possible, right? And the message I was trying to convey before is maybe 10 years ago it wasn't, but right now, any system that relies on trusting an institution in the terms of voting, I'm talking about electronic voting, is just a political design. It's not a technology necessity.
But you still need to be able to trust the technology, right? And get access to the technology. So I don't know, someone who's not really, like, who doesn't really know how to work a computer, how are they going to get access?
I would say, well, there is always elements of trust to trusted systems, like our phones, right? Our phones are trusted because they are proprietary from companies that have closed things, et cetera, et cetera. But when I say that you can remove trust, it's because it's mainly because of cryptography. And cryptography is math, and math is verifiable, right? There are few things in the world that you can trust more than math, right? And can be challenged more than math. So anything that we can solve with these tools that are openly verifiable by anyone, right? The more we are removing the need for trust for these systems. But yes, there will always be remnants, like, yeah, I'm voting, if I'm voting with my phone or I'm voting through a voting machine or things like that, there are always these black boxes remaining in the system, but there are techniques and technologies to remove them.
Yeah, but even if you trust them, how could, I mean, my grandmother couldn't, she has a phone, but she could never vote on anything. So you would probably have to have traditional voting systems in parallel until everyone's really educated about it.
Yeah, that's a challenge of accessibility, I would say, not about trust, right? So, but I agree. I mean, I think we are not ready to completely remove the physical mechanisms because there is a lot of population that don't have the means or, but I would put that challenge in a different box probably. No, it's not about trust.
No, absolutely. But also, I mean, people who are stateless, who have an issue with a legal identity, will likely also have an issue with accessing any of those solutions that might come forward, right?
I mean, yeah, I mean, we're not allowed to vote. I never was allowed to vote. So, I mean, it's one of the last things we even think about. I mean, stateless people, we usually, you know, prioritize other essentials first, survival, you know, access to freedom of movement, especially if you're in a war zone. So yeah, I mean, it's something that is important, but it also shows that due to the fact that we don't have these rights, we're ignored by the political community, by the politicians. And so it's like a vicious cycle, you know. So we're not even sure how to resolve it, but that's why we're trying to take it one step at a time and trying to be realistic at the same time. But seeing that it's important to tap into the new developments and new technology to avoid the harm that's already coming our way from that technology. And you know, we have Kenya being classical example where you have digitalization of identification, but the vulnerable populations, the stateless, are being excluded from that, and therefore they're excluded from other services. And the last thing they're thinking about is actually voting. But you know, if you can get some initial rights like employment, long term, that might actually help you resolve your statelessness, and therefore you can finally become a voter in the country. Yeah.
I think you say something that explains a big deal of that. The state still has and probably will have forever the monopoly of violence. Creating identifiers is super cheap and easy. You can have 10, right, in the blockchain. The only identifiers that matter are the identifiers that carry on liability and accountability. So basically, the power of your national identity, ID, is that I can punish you through the state, right? There is a legal framework. I can sue you. I can ask the state to exercise violence against you in certain scenarios, and that's the value of the ID, right? An ID that is not supported by a threat, right? Is not good enough to establish a contract between two parties because you have nothing to lose, right? There are many projects in the DeFi, which is decentralized finance world, that want to include identity, for something that is called non-collateralized or uncollateralized loans, which basically you are asking for a loan, but you don't have any assets to support it, and you will be supporting that loan with your own reputation. So you would lose your reputation. The concept of staking, right? You're putting money on a stake and then you misbehave, you're slash, and they take your money away. It's just another way of exercising violence against you, right? So I think if you're thinking on a plan B, you need to start thinking, okay, we have an identifier or an identity. How much are we going to put on it in terms of stake or violence or accountability, that I can be punished in the case I don't follow the rules.
Another aspect, maybe what we're forgetting, even if there's a decentralized system where you could basically create your own identity and you can participate, at the end of the day, you can only participate if you can purchase a token for which you need at least some financial means, right? And at least a phone, which if we're talking about marginalized communities or minorities in some parts of the world, they're excluded if they don't have the financial means. And you can see, you know, the prices of token. Some might be cheaper, some might be more expensive or accessible, but you have to have this extra money and maybe the device to access it. And this is also, this is a barrier in some parts of the world, if you want to think of
It's
that.
probably also a barrier today, right, with the traditional systems.
But there is another coin that anyone has and doesn't, I mean, it doesn't need to cost money, which is your uniqueness, right? If you have an identifier that you can only produce once in your life, that, for example, comes from your face scan or DNA or something that you cannot duplicate, right? You only have once in your lifetime. So that's your reputation forever, right? So yes, you can cheat in a service, you can cheat, but if the risk of the service, let's say, if I trust you, this unique identifier, if I lose $100, okay, but now you're in a blacklist. Is it worth? right? So reputation, I think, thinking in this plan B, right? Thinking in how to build identities that don't require from a central state that can uh, 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 use the violence to enforce it, right? In the end, the only thing that every human has that can use as a piece of exchange in a contractual relationship, it's a permanent identity, right? If you create an identity that cannot be duplicated or renewed or just reset, that is an asset.
I think it's much more complex than that because various data that we have as our identity, it's not absolute or permanent. Even the face, you said. Yeah, but our face
Your
gradually.
DNA is.
Yeah, DNA. Well, okay, DNA, fingerprints, and so on. But that's only one subset of data. So other data like our name, place of birth, parents, and so on and so forth, it becomes a bit more complex. Moreover, it's interesting. I had to think about like, okay, but why is it that we cannot use data of expired documents? Wouldn't it make sense to have a registry where that data is still counted as such because it is proof of who you are, right? So, I mean, when making an identity, I mean, we shouldn't just use one set of data. We should use metadata. And there's various authorities that issue various data proving that you are who you are based on your interaction with them. So I feel like there is a lot of room for creativity and a lot of room that we can't even like imagine at the moment on how to make these, I want to call them registry for lack of a better word, that we can prove we are who we are without depending on one source, centralized source of authority. But if there is that one source in terms of making that proof, I feel like it should be ourselves. You know what I mean? At the end of the day, and but that doesn't mean other authorities are not going to be involved or their data. But you know, a lot of this is new technology. A lot of this is new development. So
I don't want to answer because I want to
Well,
give space to the other panel.
the question, can I?
Yes, of course.
The question I see is who's in control of that data? Who decides what data we are giving into the system? I'm fully agree with the idea of a meta system and a meta where we can prove our identities. But in order to get there, there's so many unsolved questions yet that it will be really sensible to determine who is in control of the data, who is what data is there, and how can it be used. And especially, I think the important thing is that I, as an individual, can decide which part of my data I want to give into what purpose. And I think that this will be the absolute challenge for the future to create digital identities that are that are democracy proof. Let me put it this way.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, unfortunately, I have to stop the panel here. I think we will not find, do I have 5 minutes more? Oh, great. Okay. Well, 5 minutes more. Then, good. Okay, let me ask this. With the assumption that we have the well-intentioned state and we have the bad-intentioned state, what would be a future, like we have a democracy that is old and not considerate of the new technologies like internet and media and everything we've faced, right? How would you update the democracy system we have with the technologies you know with the assumption of a well-intentioned and the assumption of a bad-intentioned state? Just, I mean, if you don't have an answer or if you see an issue, just share your thoughts. It's a brainstorm.
I just don't want to monopolize the discussion. So.
Start.
Okay.
I mean, I just want to, I'll share the 5 minutes, right?
Yeah.
So I just want to emphasize the point of inclusion because historically democracy really did mean exclusion from very ancient Greek times. There's, in ancient Greece, very few people were able to exercise democratic rights. And I think we assume that things have changed. They haven't. Many members of their own society, even if it's a democracy, don't have this privilege. Even in Western countries like US, there's various ways you're taking away your right to vote, to be a participant in democracy is taken away, whether because you committed some crime or just because you're American Samoan. So I want to emphasize that inclusion is key. It doesn't make sense for us to honestly talk about democracy if it's so arbitrary that we exclude such large segments of the population.
So I would say good government, bad government scenario. Good government scenario, I think the focus should be on education, not on voting. And if we're talking about education, we should consider that education doesn't happen only in universities like this, but every piece of content that we see and go through every social network, right? So my focus would be in content authenticity, content provenance, authorship, traceability, etc. And for a bad government, I would remove any trace of trust assumption, right? Everything in the system that works because we need to trust someone or a closed technology, I would remove it in favor of trustless designs.
We have like 2 minutes. Anybody from you guys want to ask something or say something? The social media people. Just say who you are also.
Thank you. So my name is Nicolas. I am CTO of Agora. And I have a question mainly for voting. Privato ID during the Privato ID presentation, you talked about coercion, remote coercion. So the idea that as a citizen, I can have a gun pointed on my head when I vote at home. And I'm very curious about how we can solve that with electronic voting. I don't think it's possible. Maybe you have a solution. That's the problem I have. And I'm very curious about this. And maybe that's enough, but later I have other questions.
Yeah, the most common solution for that is to have a window of time in which the voter can revoke his vote by voting again. And that's the basis of the Macy system that I put in the slides, but it's done cryptographically. But then in some countries, like in Serbia, I think what they did is, no, it wasn't Serbia, but I think there were some experiments where the voting didn't happen in one day. It was a window of time. So you could digitally vote for all this time, but then in the last minute, you could physically go to a voting space and revoke your previous vote by voting again, right? So even if the guy was pointing to your head, unless he kidnapped you for the full week with you, then you have all that time to revoke.
Okay, now that was the 5 minutes.
Thank you very much to you all, Sebastian, for your patience with the technology and all that. But I think has been good. You've been broadcasted to a lot of countries. And Dieter, thank you very much also.